get closer to Asia.
Yeah.
For this professor, and thanks again for you guys coming, and thanks professor for being with us.
Yeah.
And thanks
Luciano.
visitors.
Yeah, welcome. For those who weren't here yesterday, this is kind of a special class that Luciano and I put together. So it's not a usual law school class. So yesterday, we wanted to make sure that everybody understood the basic legal framework for international trade law, and then also something about the basic U.S. legal framework for for the U.S. president to act in international trade. But the big idea for the course is to talk about international trade situation now with China, the U.S., Brazil, this crazy situation. So we'll get there later in the week. Maybe Thursday and Friday we'll get. And Friday is kind of an open season for discussion. So, but I wanted to present some basic stuff about the Chinese legal system today, and then tomorrow I want to talk about China's economic development model and how their legal system and their economic development model have developed. And the short story is it's similar to what happened in other East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Similar, but also kind of different because of China's history. But if you want to put China's development policy in a particular category, it would be pretty similar to like Korea, Taiwan in the past. So, and I don't know a lot about Brazil. I know something about Brazil, but that's why I'm looking forward to hearing more about Brazil. So today I wanted to talk about the modern Chinese legal system. So to do that, so I'll start with the traditional Chinese legal system. Just say something about that. China has had law much longer than like my people. My people were living in caves, and the Chinese had elaborate legal systems, and they cared about law. So one stereotype is that Asian people or Chinese people don't believe in law in some way, and that's just kind of it's a complete misunderstanding. They had a very interesting attitude toward law. They used contracts a lot, and this is 2,000 years ago. This is, BC. This is 2,500 years ago. If you dig up tombs of Chinese officials from that time, they find graves, and they would bury law codes with the officials. And we don't do that. We lawyers don't. When they die, they don't want to be buried with their law books in our culture. But in Chinese culture, they had a very, very serious view about law and its functions in society. But most of the published law, the state law, was not oriented toward individuals. So the state law, if you think about how the legal norms were directed, so if you think about our legal norm, like criminal law, it's directed to us, right? It says, if you do this, you will be punished like that, right? So a lot of our law, most of our law is directed to citizens, and it sets out our rights and our duties. The published Chinese law codes were directed to lower level officials. And those officials were not just judges. In our system, you could say, well, the law is directed to judges. It tells the judges what to do. But their lower level officials were not judges. They were general officials. So an official would be in charge of an area, and they would resolve legal disputes, but they would also have responsibilities for, keeping the granaries full of grain for a bad harvest, and carrying out the official religious ceremonies and things like that. So the lower level officials had all kinds of responsibilities, and settling disputes was just one small part of their functions. But the legal norms from the state told those officials what to do. So the direction of the norms was just different. And it would say, well, if one person does this, here's how much you should punish that person. So it's kind of like criminal law, but it wasn't directed to the people, it was directed to the officials. And it wasn't really general. There was kind of a class basis to it. So the amount of punishment that you received differed based on who you were. So, and Confucianism was kind of the ideology. So if a son failed to respect his father, he would be hit, 10 times with a bamboo stick or something like that. If the son failed to respect his mother, he would only be hit 5 times with the bamboo stick because the father is more serious than the mother. Anyway, Confucian ideology, Confucian values just were completely mixed in with this stuff. And it was basically hostile to private litigation. So one of the constant messages through over 2,000 years was that the official's job was to stop litigation. It was anti-litigation. The whole system, like our system, sort of encourages people to pursue their individual rights. If I have a property right and you infringe my property right, the system is set up to help me sue you, and we'll use law to resolve that dispute. The message in the Chinese system to the official was keep those disputes out of the official system. Force the people to settle their disputes without bringing an actual law case. It was anti-lawyers. They had special names for lawyers that were bad, and there was no actual profession of lawyers that was recognized. But there were people who did that stuff. There were people who would help resolve disputes. But in the official ideology, they were bad people. They caused trouble, kind of like lawyers do. Sometimes lawyers cause trouble. And the official system was set up to suppress that kind of law practice. So law was a big deal in Chinese history, but they had ideas about law that were very different from the Western tradition. And then people used contracts all the time, too. When Japan constructed a legal system in the 7th century, they borrowed the Chinese law code. So China had the Tang dynasty in China. The Tang code was borrowed and imposed in Japan when Japan became a kind of nation state. So that's the year like 650 or something. So Japan had a long history of following this sort of Chinese. I mean, you can think about China it was sort of like Latin and Roman law in the West. I mean, the whole region was permeated with this kind of Chinese legal tradition. So the Koreans adopted the Chinese law codes similarly, 8th century, 9th century, something like that. The Koreans imported it, the Japanese imported it, the Vietnamese imported it. And so, included with the codes themselves would be the kind of ideology of it. So this litigiousness thing it sort of sounds like it's a cultural thing, that Japanese just don't believe in suing each other. But it's hard to prove that because their legal system is also not very friendly to litigation. So, there aren't very many lawyers. So the countries in East Asia have, even in modern times, have kept the number of actual licensed lawyers very small. The people who would be barristers in the English system, the people who have the right to appear in court, it's a very small. Koreans did that too. And then legal fees are very high. They have a system like England where the loser pays. So if I sue you and I lose, I have to pay your legal fees. We don't do that in the US, right? In the US, we like litigation. We like suing each other. So, I don't have to, if I lose, you still have to pay your legal fees. And they don't allow contingency fees. they didn't historically allow contingency fees. You know, contingency fee is, you don't pay me anything as your lawyer unless we win the suit. And if we win the suit, then you give me 30%, something like that. So in the US, that encourages litigation because the citizen, you know, it's kind of free. The lawyer. Do you allow that in Brazil, or? Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. In Asia, so in most of East Asia, the formal rules discourage litigation also. So it's hard to tell whether it was a cultural thing or whether it's just the rules. But the rules also might be caused by the culture. So it's all very complicated. But so this Chinese system, and the other thing was people used contracts also among themselves. Even if they didn't ever plan to use the courts to enforce the contracts, they used contracts a lot. And they would, like for family estate, you know, sort of dividing up property, transferring, things like that. So anyway, so China had this rich legal tradition. It lasted, you know, up until about 1911. So there's Imperial China, or whatever you want to call it. And the oldest law codes were probably, you know, 500 BC. I mean, maybe earlier. We just don't have them. But like I said, when they dig up the graves from this time and earlier, they find they would write the law codes on pieces of bamboo, and they buried, like you find them in the tombs. So 1911, the Qing dynasty falls. The Qing was the last Chinese dynasty. And they had ruled for about, since 1650 roughly, so 1718. Yeah, they had ruled for quite a while. And the Qing didn't reform. So if you know anything about this time period, Japan had started to reform 50 years before. But the Chinese leadership was very conservative, and they didn't reform China. So finally, the whole thing fell apart, and the Qing dynasty falls. And the next period, I had just put 1949. What do we call this? We call this sort of Republican China. And what happened in that period was the whole Chinese legal system was going to be reformed, but nobody really, it was very fluid. Things were changing very quickly. And this kind of relates to Mackenzie's history. You know, there were missionaries in China, and some of the missionaries were like legal missionaries. So especially the Americans and the British were active in China. The British had, you know, colony sort of outposts in China. So they were bringing in common law ideas. And some, you know, young Chinese people were coming to the US and studying law. They were going to England and studying law. There was a law school in Shanghai that was started by an American missionary university. So they were teaching common law in Shanghai at this school. But there were also a lot of people in China in this period who were more oriented toward civil law. And largely because Japan had already adopted a civil law system before 1911. The Japanese, by 1880, 1890, the Japanese had already pretty much completed a European-style legal system, mostly German, with some French influence in different areas. I'm not a common law, I'm not a civil law scholar, but the scholars of that say, well, Japanese criminal law was more influenced by the French system, but Japanese commercial law, constitutional law was more influenced by Germany. But basically, it's a kind of German-style civil law system that Japan adopted. And so a lot of Chinese people were looking to Japan as a model. The Japanese had already translated all those Western legal concepts into Chinese characters, because Japanese language uses Chinese characters. So, a concept like, well, even the concept of law, or the concept of individual rights, the concept of human rights, the idea of a constitution, somebody had to translate the word constitution from Western language into an Asian language, and it was the Japanese who did that. So, and so a lot of Chinese would go to Japan and study law in Japan because they could read everything. But a lot of the reformers saw Japan as the model to follow, because it was an Asian country, pretty similar, very close. But also, they would say, well, it's a developing, in modern language, they would say, well, it's a developing country. And Japan has developed pretty successfully. They've already modernized their economy and industry. Their military is strong. So Japan should be our model. So, the outcome of this period, there was a lot of law reform starting in 1911. The Westernizers undertook a big program of law reform in China, and most of it was kind of German oriented, because they had to create a whole Western system. They hadn't had courts. There was no separation of law from administration, from religion. Everything was together in the old system. So they had to create courts. They had to enact law codes. They had to have a constitution. They had to have statutes. They had to have a legislature. All these things. They had to have a legal profession. They had never respected a legal profession. They sort of had these people who did that stuff, but they were trying to suppress them. Now they had to create a legal profession. And so what you see in this period is a lot of really interesting stuff, and they were on their way to developing a kind of European-style legal system. And China was very open in this period. Shanghai was the financial center of Asia, more than Tokyo. Hong Kong was nothing. Hong Kong was like a backwater. It was Shanghai that was the center. And because Shanghai the foreign powers had taken Shanghai through these treaties. So there was an international settlement. There was the English settlement. The French had part of Shanghai. There was an American zone. The Japanese had part of Shanghai. So Shanghai was divided up into these little colonial areas. And it was the business center of China. So they created special courts in Shanghai. The U.S. we had what are called consular courts, where your embassy, your consular officials act as the court system. And so the American consul in Shanghai, those cases could come and be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court in Washington, right? And the same with the English courts, the same, I assume, with the French courts, the Japanese courts, whatever. And then there were special courts in Shanghai that handled disputes between Chinese people and foreigners. In those cases, they had to create law, so the Shanghai, they kind of created their own legal system. So what happened to all this? What happened to all this was the Communist Revolution in 1949. So the people that had created all this lost, right? And they lost badly, yeah. So they took all this to Taiwan. So if you look at the Taiwanese legal system today, it's this legal system. It was created on the mainland, mostly in the 20s and 30s. If you look at some statutes in Taiwan, and you look at it's a civil law system. The statutes all have dates, and you can look at the date, and some of those statutes were enacted in the mainland in like the 1930s. I think the Civil Procedure Code. They're German-style codes. They call it the 6 codes, right? Civil code, commercial code, criminal code, criminal procedure, civil procedure, constitution, and in the civil law way, they're all in one book. The book is called the Six Codes, and the lawyers keep it on their desk because it's the civil law mythology, right? All the answers are in the code book, so you just have to look in the code book and you can find the answer. I worked as a lawyer in Korea for about 4 years, and the Korean lawyers, they all had the 6 codes on their desk, and if you'd ask the Korean lawyer a question, he'd put his head down and start looking through the code book. And to an American, this is just like, no. There's a big culture clash. Anyway. So this is the legal system that's on Taiwan. So what did the communists do after 1949? The first thing they did was they abolished all of this, right? They closed the courts. They said basically all that law is not in effect anymore. So they abolished the whole legal system. Because it was bourgeois, rightist, capitalist, whatever. So they abolished it all. And when I was a student in Shanghai at a law school, I met this guy, and he said he had been a judge in Shanghai in this period. He was a judge in Shanghai in early 1950s. And he said, yeah, the communists won. So they're up in Beijing, and they say the old legal system is abolished. And he said, well, we still had work to do. Like there were still cases, and we didn't know what to do because the government had abolished the legal system. So he said, we came up with our own rules about procedure in the Shanghai courts because there were no more official rules. But pretty quickly, the people who had staffed the old legal system were also purged politically, because lawyers, judges, everybody involved with the old system was seen as politically bad. So they were pushed out of their jobs. They were sent to re-education camps. The ones who were lucky got out of China and went to Taiwan or went to the US or went to Hong Kong somewhere. Because the Chinese communists were particularly hostile to law. So compared to the Soviets, the Russians. So what did they do? So they abolished the whole system. They purged the people. They closed the institutions. They closed the courts. They closed the Ministry of Justice. They closed everything. In the early 1950s, so I'll say early 1950s, there was a period of sort of peace where it wasn't clear what was going to happen. It wasn't clear how serious Mao and the communists were about destroying everything. So in the early 50s, there were some of these Chinese legal scholars who had been educated before 1949. There was a project to create a new legal system in the early 50s that was modeled on the Soviet system. So the Soviet Union had law. They had lots of law, and they had legal institutions. They had the procuracy in the courts and whatever. The Soviets sort of had a legal system. So the Chinese law reformers in the early 50s decided, okay, well, we'll copy the Soviet system. So they translated Soviet law into Chinese, and they were working on a civil code that would be like a Soviet-style civil code, whatever is in that. But if you think about it, they don't need a lot of law because they had also destroyed the private economy. So if you don't have private property, a lot of law is no longer necessary. You still need criminal law, but like commercial law, contract law, antitrust law, intellectual property law, labor law, you don't need any of that anymore. But by the mid-50s, even that kind of Soviet legal development fell apart because Mao really was anti-law in a way that like Stalin was not. I think Stalin kind of liked law if he controlled it. Mao had this ideological idea that you didn't need law. So they did a couple of things. One, they called the anti-rightist movement. Mao liked movements. He didn't like law. So the anti-rightist movement first, and then the Great Leap Forward. I'm sure that, if you don't, I'm sure there's a way to say this stuff in Portuguese. But so the anti-rightist movement started because Mao felt that, some of the communists, it's human nature, right? Some of the people would have joined the Communist Party because the Communist Party won, not because they believed in communism. It's like, well, those guys won, so I'm going to be a communist too. Mao wanted to get those people out of the party. So they did this anti-rightist movement, even though most of the rightists had actually left China to go to Taiwan. I don't think there were a lot of rightists living in China by the mid-50s, but Mao launched this anti-rightist movement. So the lawyers, again, were attacked, right? Because the lawyers who had stayed in, like, Shanghai, they were seen as rightists because they believed in property rights and individual human rights and stuff like that. And then, so that closed down the effort to create a Soviet legal system. The people who were involved with trying to create a Soviet-style legal system, they were seen as rightists and purged. And then in the 50s, Mao, another movement, and people say this, they say, well, that's how Mao wanted to govern China. He wanted China to be governed through movements that were announced by the Communist Party in Beijing, and then all the Communist Party officials throughout the country would engage in this movement to try to make people do stuff. So instead of a legal system with transparency and predictability and all this stuff, you'd have movements. So the Great Leap Forward, does anybody know about this movement? This was, so what did they try to do?
Well, as I remember, they abolished private property, and farmers didn't have right to their own land.
They collectivized, right? The collective, everybody had to work on it. If you were in the countryside, and China still does this legally. The cities that's a legal category, and the countryside is a different legal category. If you lived in the countryside, you had to join a collective farm. And if you lived in the city, you had to join a work unit, they called it. And I think these are Soviet things, right? Stalin had collectivized agriculture in Russia in probably the 1930s.
And I've heard that in this period, there was a lot of famine, hunger in China.
Yeah, they call it the Great Leap Forward famine because Mao's idea was they wanted to catch up to Britain in steel production. So this is the ancient past, but Britain used to produce a lot of steel, right? And Mao and his people got the idea, we have to develop our industry. And so the target was to pass England in steel production within like 2 years. And this was a movement coming from Beijing. So everybody said, okay, well, I need to do that then. And so a lot of people in the countryside, they shifted from producing food to trying to produce steel in the countryside. They had no idea how to produce steel, that there were like little home steel mills trying to melt metal, and people were stealing the metal out of buildings to melt down to turn into steel so they could meet the quota, because the system operated through quotas. If you were the Communist Party official in some village, you had to report upward how much steel your village supported, or your village produced, and so everybody was trying to produce steel. It was a stupid thing, and it caused the famine. I mean, because there may have been weather problems also, but a lot of the famine was caused by the diversion of agricultural people into this ridiculous steel production thing, which lasts until roughly 1975, you could say. I'll say 1976. So the Cultural Revolution was, again, it was started by Mao trying to maintain, I would say, I mean, people disagree about this, but to me, it was Mao and his inner circle trying to maintain their control over the Communist Party, their personal control. So they decided that there were internal enemies within the party, and so the party people attacked themselves. And they got young people to lead this. So they got like university students to attack the professors in the universities. The people we call Red Guards were these young college students who were brainwashed. And so in the Cultural Revolution, the legal system situation got even worse. They reclosed the law schools. They sent the law professors out to the countryside to be farmers. I mean, they sent people away. They called it sending down. So the law students and the law professors were sent out to the countryside. The law schools were closed. And things like the Ministry of Justice was closed. The courts were closed. The legal system was basically shut down again, with the possible exception of criminal. I mean, they continued to punish people, right? But that you can have a pretty simple legal system for punishing people. So and that really, so like these old guys, by now they were pretty old. The people who had studied law in this period, if they were still alive, they were purged again in the Cultural Revolution. I mean, I had a different friend who, he was actually he was a barrister. He had gone to England, and he was like a member of the temple, inner temple, or he was in one of the inns of court in the British barrister system, and he spent like 10 years in prison during the Cultural Revolution. They found these guys, they put them back in prison. So, yeah.
Do you think this was similar to Stalinism in like the fear of being persecuted in the country, like, or being denounced by a neighbor or something?
Oh, totally. Oh, totally. I mean, it may be worse than Russia. Russia, my impression of Russia is it was a more organized totalitarianism. It wasn't chaos. Mao liked chaos, which is really interesting, because some of the Americans, and this, Professor Unger, right, who's kind of a Brazilian, kind of an American, the critical legal studies guy, Roberto Unger, though that generation in the West was kind of attracted to Mao, right, the 1960s generation, the boomers, a lot of them were kind of attracted to Mao because I think they had decided that Soviet communism was authoritarian. The Soviets had invaded Hungary. The Soviets had invaded Czechoslovakia. They could tell that the Soviet system was not bringing the utopia. So some of them thought, well, okay, maybe Maoist China is a kind of utopia that we want. So they had the little red book. I'm sure in Brazil you had people with Mao's little red book, and they would wave the red book around in the 60s. Yeah. So Unger would, if you read Unger's writing, sometimes he talks about kind of this idea of permanent revolution. So Mao talked about permanent revolution. The Soviets in Russia didn't want permanent revolution. They had one revolution. Stalin's in charge. That's it. We don't need another revolution. Mao had this, he liked to encourage like new revolutions. So anyway, this was a total disaster, right? And Mao dies in 1976, and these reformer guys come back into power. Mao's wife, and they decided to blame the Cultural Revolution on these four people, so they called them the Gang of Four. So Mao's wife gets blamed. The women always get blamed for these things. it wasn't Mao's wife, it was Mao, but they can't blame Mao, right? So Mao's wife and these 3 other guys, they put them on trial, which was quite interesting. They call it the Gang of 4 trial. And it was a signal that now China was going to take law seriously again in a kind of strange way. They got old lawyers to represent the Gang of 4, and they televised this kind of to the world and also to China internally. And I think it was a signal that we don't like Maoism. It didn't work. It's too chaotic. A lot of innocent people were punished and killed and whatever. So it was a signal that now we're going to start trying to build a legal system again. So they have this trial of the Gang of 4. And after that's over, then they start rebuilding the legal system again. So 1978, basically this is I'd say the period we're in now started in about 1978. They reopened the law schools. So just a few, but they reopened, Peking University and a few other law schools. They reopened. They started admitting a few students. They brought professors back from the countryside. They reinstalled them as professors at these law schools. They didn't have they didn't have a legal system. So they had to start enacting law too. So, and they didn't really have law books. They had the old books from before 1949, but those were no good. So if you talk to people who were educated in this period, like Chinese people, I have friends who went to law school in this period, 1978, 1980, and they said the legal materials were mostly just translated Soviet law books. There was a lot of theory, a lot of Marxist theory, socialist legal system theory, but not a lot of actual, what we would recognize as law, because they didn't really have any law. So then, in addition to opening the law schools, they started recreating the institutions of a legal system. So they started working on creating a bar exam. They had to recreate the judiciary. They had to recreate training of judges. And they have, since that time, they've put an enormous amount of money and energy into building a legal system. Strangely, in some ways, because in some ways it's still a very flawed legal system, but the current government wants the legal system to be a central part of its rule. So if you go to China, you see these fantastic giant courthouse buildings with marble floors and beautiful courtrooms, and the image is Western, right? I think at one point the judges were going to wear wigs, like horsehair wigs, but it's all kind of strange because it doesn't really work like a Western legal system, but it kind of looks like a Western legal system. And why did they do this? Well, so the guy who really should get credit for this is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, after Mao's death, there was a couple years of uncertainty, and then Deng Xiaoping became the top leader. And Deng had been sent to the countryside himself in the Cultural Revolution. One of Deng's sons was pushed out of a building window and was paralyzed during the Cultural Revolution. So Deng's son was, in a wheelchair because his legs had been destroyed. So Deng had suffered a lot personally in the Cultural Revolution. So he, in addition to leading the rebuilding of the legal system, they also started their economic opening at this point. So people who study Chinese economic policy, the date of 1978 is really key, because before that, they had been basically isolated from the international economy, except within the socialist world, where there was some trade. I think there was always some trade within the socialist world, but a lot of it was barter. So they would get vodka from the East Germans, and they would send grain to East Germany or something. There was trading within the socialist world, which was much bigger at that time, right? The Soviet Union was big. Eastern Europe was socialist. North Korea was socialist. Vietnam was socialist. So there was trade that went on, but they didn't require a legal system like you need now for international trade. And they decided they wanted to open their economy to the world in 1978. So they needed law because the foreigners, they're not going to come in unless you have some kind of legal infrastructure. So they started, but they did a very characteristic Chinese thing, which was that they created special statutes first. And they created them as temporary experiment statutes. So, people who think about law and development usually think, well, you need a system of property rights. And for property rights, you need a constitution and you need a property law. And then, and you need all that first. You need that infrastructure first. I think that's not correct. The Chinese started without any of that. They didn't have a constitution, and even now nobody cares about the constitution. But they didn't have a basic civil code, they didn't have a basic properties code, they didn't have a commercial code, they didn't have any of these basic fundamental things. They would just create special statutes. So they created a joint venture law, which is just like 2 pages or something. It says basically you can have a joint venture and, and your rights and duties will be governed by the joint venture contract, something like that. And the foreigners also wanted to know about the tax situation because taxes drive everything, right? So the Chinese pretty early created some rules about international taxation to say, well, the profits, basically, if foreign investors come in and they make a profit, how much are we going to take as tax? And that's all the foreigners needed to know, because once they knew that, then they could do the economic calculation. So I think those were the first statutes in China that the foreigners cared about, and they weren't really enacted through a legislative process. They were just these special little laws. And then they created special economic zones, especially along the coast, where foreigners were allowed to bring in capital, set up factories, and then export the goods from those factories. And the Chinese, they call them SEZs, the special economic zones, got going pretty early, by the early 1980s. And that is, that's where the China's economic miracle started, was those reforms in the early 1970s. And it was really before their legal system had been reconstructed at all. So by the mid-'80s, they had created a system of courts. They were enacting statutes. They set up the stuff that's in the reading. But they tended to, and they still do this, the basic problem or the basic issue with their legal system is that the relationship between the Communist Party and the legal system is unclear, even to Chinese people, but it's very unclear to foreigners because, in theory, the Chinese Communist Party is still above the legal system. And so if you get a document, they had to invent a new term because there were so many legal documents flying around in China that they came up with the term of normative document, because it just means, meaning a document that is kind of like law, but we don't know exactly where it fits in the hierarchy of legal norms. A proper legal system, there's a hierarchy, right? There's a constitution, there are statutes, there are regulations. If you're a lawyer in the US, a lot of what we do is figure out, okay, where does that legal norm come from? What's its relationship to these other parts of there's a hierarchy of legal norms. The Germans love this. We don't really care about it that much, but if you study law in Germany, the hierarchy of legal norms is a fundamental thing that really structures all legal systems. The Chinese have never really figured that out because they started building their legal system kind of from the bottom up, and authority is very fractured in China. There is a legislature, but nobody really thinks the legislature makes law unless the Communist Party approves of it already, right? So the legislature is not really independent from the party. The courts aren't really independent from the party. There's an executive branch, so they sort of have the branches of government. They sort of have an executive branch, but that's really dominated by the Communist Party. And then the Communist Party itself makes rules. Well, in Brazil, Lula's party doesn't get to just make rules. They may have internal party rules, but if you're not in the party, you don't have to follow the internal party rules. In China, the party gets to make rules that everybody has to follow. And the relationship between party rules and regular law is kind of fuzzy sometimes. And that's, again, because they started building this system from the bottom up. By the 90s, so if you want to understand the periods of this, the 80s and 90s were periods of very, very rapid growth, both in the economy and in the legal system. By 1992, so I studied in China in the 80s, and there were no real Chinese law firms at that point. Because, in the Soviet system, especially under Mao, what was the point of a law firm? You didn't really need a legal profession. What would lawyers do? There was no private economy. So lawyers would, and criminal defense was not really a thing because what do you say? I mean, so I met some lawyers and they said, well, we do a lot of like family, even in communist China, you had marriages and then you had marriages fall apart. And so you had things like child custody, you had maybe some personal property that needed to be divided up. But as the economy grew, then you started to need lawyers who could really do international transactions, property transactions, stuff like that. Yep.
At what time was the Tiananmen Square massacre?
Tiananmen Square was 1989. So Tiananmen Square was when the student movement in Beijing and all across China. And it was the time when the Soviet world was falling apart in Germany and Eastern Europe and whatever. And in June of 1989, the big student movement in Tiananmen Square in Beijing that was then crushed by the government. So but that period, through the 1980s, there was a lot of optimism, especially by young people, that China would really reform, and that they looked at the Soviet Union, they looked at Gorbachev, and they thought, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we just, why don't we have political reform to follow our economic reform? Because the economic reform was already happening. In the 80s, they had, but this is both in the countryside and the city. So in the countryside, the collective farm model is not efficient because people like to work for themselves. The productivity of the collective farms was always low. So in the reform in the countryside was to allow farmers to keep some of their production and sell it on private markets. So before that, you couldn't do that. If you were a farmer, you worked on the collective farm, and the collective farm owned all of the rice or wheat or whatever, and the collective farm turned it over to the state. So they called that the household responsibility system. A household, you'd sign a sort of contract, and the contract would say, well, if you produce 100 pounds of rice, that's your quota. Your responsibility is to produce 100 pounds of rice. If you produce 110 pounds of rice, you can take that extra 10 pounds and you can sell it on the private market. So this was recognizing that private markets were legitimate and important. There was no real legal structure for this. There was no property law to govern those private markets. The private markets just appeared, especially around the big cities. So in Shanghai in the 80s, you'd see people from the countryside would come in and they'd have a blanket on the ground with vegetables, fresh vegetables, and you would buy them for cash. And that was, so the countryside people got rich earlier, especially the ones who lived around the big cities. And this is the kind of thing that North Korea has started to do, because North Korea was kind of, I mean, it's very much like China, and the collective agriculture just doesn't work very effectively. So North Korea has started to experiment. Well, they're pretty far along in allowing private markets, but they're just tolerated. There's no legal, you have no legal protection, for this kind of activity. And in the cities, by the mid-1980s, China had also allowed people to leave their work units. So before that, you were assigned to a work unit. This is a Soviet system. And the work unit provided your housing, it provided your food, like your ration coupons. People didn't use cash, they got coupons. So you get rice, oil, meat, whatever, these little coupons, and you would go to the store, the government store, and you would use your coupons to get your rice and your whatever. And all that came through your work unit. So, university faculty were part of a work unit. Everybody had a work unit. There was no way to not be part of a work unit. It was kind of illegal, I guess, to not be part of a work unit. And in the 80s, they started allowing people to leave their work units and set up a private business. So in Shanghai in the 80s, most of those were little restaurants. Chinese people like good food, and the government food was bad. The government restaurants were no good. And plus, you don't need a lot of capital to set up a restaurant. You just need a little space, and somebody has to cook. So in the 80s, you would go into, you'd see these little restaurants on the street, and there would be a sign up on the wall that that these people had registered as an individual operation. It's a getihu. The Chinese term is, I don't know how to translate it, to the individual something. It's like an individual proprietor or something like that. And they had to get a license from the government to do that. But otherwise, there was no real legal structure around those things. But that was, again, it was, I think, that idea took off pretty quickly in China, I think, partly culturally. I mean, China had not had communism for that long. It came in 1949, and by the mid-1980s, it was already kind of liberalizing. So their experience of real Soviet-style economic life, social life, was fairly short, and a lot of people remembered the previous period, which was much more kind of a market-oriented place. So that period was, very successful. A lot of people were optimistic that China would liberalize. The 1989 Tiananmen situation, the Chinese leadership, the lesson they took from that was that they would never allow a Gorbachev figure in China. They blamed Gorbachev for destroying the Soviet Union, the conservative communists, people like Xi Jinping. They looked at the Soviet thing, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and like Putin, they see it as a disaster. And so what they've been doing since then is to try to have both economic, basically quite a liberal economy, but maintaining the kind of political system. So perestroika without glasnost, or glasnost without perestroika, whichever one, They're not going to let them both happen. They're going to have one and not the other. Yeah.
I was thinking about the book from Asimov and Robson, Why Nations Fail. A book from Asimov, Why Nations Fail.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yes. And in the book, they say that the model of China's growth is unsustainable in the long run, as it was with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that, and it occurred to me that some billionaires or some very successful entrepreneurs in China, they seem to disappear, like Jack Ma.
Yeah.
Where is Jack Ma? So what is your take on that?
Oh, this is you're anticipating the fourth class, or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's evidence of what I'm saying. It hasn't really changed. Like they look at somebody like Jack Ma, who Jack Ma is the founder of Alibaba, or and it's more like authoritarian capitalism. It's more like, I don't know, Mussolini or something. It's like, okay, you can get rich, but stay out of politics. And if you get into politics too much, we can make you disappear. And the legal system is not going to help you, right? So is that sustainable? You know what Keynes said, right? In the long run, we're all dead. So what's the long run? I mean, yeah. So those guys, like Osamoglu, they have a very, their style of analysis differs from mine, because they want to paint a picture about the whole world, and they want to generalize in a way. And I think the generalizing, and they tend not to know a lot about particular countries. And so you could look at a country like South Korea, and you could say, well, that proves that they're right. Eventually a kind of authoritarian capitalism. Eventually, people will demand, you'll have a middle class, and the middle class will demand more democracy, and you'll get democratization kind of naturally. And that did sort of happen in South Korea. You can say the same about Taiwan. But that doesn't mean it happens naturally in China. Countries differ a lot. So what's happened? I would say, by the early 1990s, for lawyers, China was allowing in foreign law firms. So the Chinese leadership has been super pragmatic. So they may have believed in communism or whatever, but for their economy to be fully integrated into the world, they needed legal expertise, and they didn't have local legal expertise. So they decided to allow in foreign law firms. The first foreign law firms started operating in China in the 80s, but they weren't legalized. But of course, the Chinese government knew that they were there. So, like Baker and Mackenzie. Baker and Mackenzie, it used to be the biggest law firm in the world. Baker and Mackenzie had a little tiny office, and they called it like a trading company or something. It was like Baker and Associates Trading Company on their door or something like that. Couder Brothers, an American firm, Couder Brothers was there. Same thing, little tiny one-person office. And those firms had been operating around the world for decades. Those Baker and Mackenzie probably had an office in Soviet Russia, and Couder Brothers definitely had an office in Soviet Russia, because there was always some kind of trade going on between the East and the West, and those firms had lawyers who could do those international transactions. But the transactions were pretty simple. They were like trading grain for steel or something. But China was getting all this foreign investment, and they wanted foreign investment, which again makes them different from countries that believe in sort of autonomy or dependency theory or these kinds of things where you don't want foreign investment because you're sort of hostile to foreign investment. The Chinese were very pragmatic about foreign investment. And because I think for me, they had watched Japan and Taiwan and Korea, who they think of as their little brothers. Like from the Chinese worldview, Japan, Korea, Taiwan are all like your little brothers. And you should be richer and more powerful than your little brothers. Your little brother should not be richer and more powerful than you are. So they looked and they said, well, how did Taiwan get rich? Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, they got rich by engaging with the global economy, particularly exporting. So this export-led development model, the Chinese didn't invent it. They just looked around at their neighbors and thought, well, that's the way to develop. Which is quite interesting because the critique of all that has come kind of from the left. The critique that the international economy is unfair and we should develop on our own, all that stuff. The Chinese, I think, never accepted that. So by 1992, they're licensing foreign law firms to operate in Beijing. And they had you could apply, they had like a lottery, there was a list, I think they licensed like 22 foreign law firms to open offices in Beijing. And it was mostly American firms, some English firms, a few European firms, but mostly the American firms who went into Beijing and Shanghai and opened law firms. And they grew like crazy. And they hired, the way that, and the Chinese were very pragmatic about this. Their legal market was more open than the Japanese legal market or the Korean legal market or Taiwan. Those other countries, they really worked hard to keep the foreign lawyers in a narrow little box. I worked in Seoul in the early 90s as a lawyer, and there were no foreign law firms allowed in Seoul. And the Korean law firms could hire people like me, but the Korean government knew exactly how many of us there were, and they wouldn't allow very many. So a Korean law firm could, if they had international work, they could hire foreign lawyers to work with them. So visa category of foreign legal consultants, and the Korean government and the Korean lawyers watched it very carefully because they were protectionist. Lawyers are always protecting their own business interests. And maybe China was so open because they didn't have a legal profession, so their legal profession couldn't mobilize to get protection from the government. The Korean lawyers and the Japanese lawyers, the Taiwanese lawyers, they already had their own legal professions. They could lobby their governments to keep the foreign lawyers out. The Chinese government, the Chinese legal profession was in its infancy at that point. Plus, the Chinese government isn't really responsive. They can do whatever they want, right? If the leadership decides to let foreign law firms in, they're going to let foreign law firms in. And so the 90s and up, I'd say through 2010 or so, were this period of amazing economic growth in China. If you look at economic statistics, they were growing at something like 10% a year for like a decade, at least a decade, which is kind of unheard of in the world, in world history, except if you look at like Korea and Taiwan in certain periods. So Korea and Taiwan both had growth episodes like that, where they grew for maybe 15 or 20 years, just continuously upward at like 7, 8, 9, 10% a year. And China did that too. And they've integrated into the world the way you've seen it. A lot of their exports were actually through the foreign invested sector. So when Americans complain about Chinese exports, it's like, well, who's exporting? Well, it's American joint ventures in China that are exporting to the U.S. Or it's German, it's Volkswagen, or it's the foreign investors in China who are doing two things. One, they're exporting, but they're also teaching the Chinese business people how to export, how to manufacture. And more recently, the venture capital has done kind of the same thing. So, people complain about Chinese tech companies, and then you say, well, who are the owners of those Chinese tech companies, and it's venture capital from Silicon Valley. That's who's, Alibaba and a lot of the big Chinese tech companies. So in that period, China, especially China and the US, got super integrated in a way that people don't really understand. I mean, people talked about chimerica. It's like there's one as an economic thing, this chimerica. And again, people were pretty optimistic about the legal system being built. And if you look at it now, it's basically a kind of civil law system, right? They were influenced a lot by Germany and a lot by Japan and Taiwan, because Taiwan, their legal system's in Chinese, and so they don't even have to translate it from Japanese to Chinese. It's just a Chinese legal system. So the basic structures of the Chinese legal system are kind of German. The education is kind of German. It's a kind of lecture format. It's based on codes. But then in particular areas, they've been influenced a lot by the US, particularly regulatory fields. So like if you looked at like securities regulation in China, the regulation of securities markets, there's something called the Chinese CSRC, Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission, is the English translation, CSRC. And if you look at the CSRC, it's pretty clear that they modeled it after the American Securities and Exchange Commission. And they did that in some particular regulatory areas. And that's probably true with a lot of civil law countries, right? That civil law, the modern regulatory, yeah, you have.
That's the CVM. It's quite close to SEC.
Yeah, it's. I don't know why it happened. I mean, that's a different story. But
Why? Because Americans invented.
But you could regulate securities some other way, couldn't you, or not? Maybe not.
I think you start from those who invented this field. Let's say,
Mm-hmm.
Antitrust, so Sherman Act,
Right.
influence other
Yeah.
jurisdictions, FCPA,
Yeah. Right.
securities.
What we did, which is in Latin America, I know this has been kind of controversial politically, was the independent, what we call the independent regulatory commission model. So independent for us was this, you would create these commissions and you would try to insulate them from ordinary politics, So the independent, and not every American likes this. I mean, Trump doesn't like it, a lot of Americans, but it was an American idea. I think we can take credit for the independent commission model. The Chinese don't like it. I mean, so their securities commission sort of looks like an independent commission, but they don't allow anybody to be independent. So nobody's independent. The courts aren't independent. So you're certainly not going to have an independent commission that's really independent. And I think that, I know that some of my Latin American friends, that the independent commission model was sort of associated with neoliberalism, and it was kind of bad. It was like a bad American export that was neoliberal somehow. I never really understood that criticism, but it's an interesting criticism. But that's what the Chinese legal system looks like now. So they've taken, in environmental law, they've taken things too. So like environmental impact statements, the idea that before you can build something, you have to produce an impact statement of what the environmental impact would be. They've done some stuff like that. And I'd say, let me say this before and then I'll ask. So the really fundamental structural thing that was happening through, say, 2000 to 2010 or so, there was also an effort to separate the party from the government, which, as you can imagine, that was kind of political but a lot of people believed in it. You know, they have a whole government apparatus, like, that goes, you know, from Beijing. They have a national legislature, they have a Supreme Court, they have these structures of government, and those go all the way down through the country. So they have, below Beijing, they have provinces, the provinces have legislatures, the provinces have governors, the local governments have legislatures. I mean, they have a whole government structure, they have these agencies, they have all this stuff. And you could have just a civil service system where the people who work in the government are part of the civil service, and that in other, you know, in a democracy, you would expect that the government would be separated from the parties. In China, of course, the party has a whole apparatus from Beijing down to the lowest level village. There's a Communist Party head. And of course, people like Mao didn't believe in separating the government from the party, but the reformers were trying to separate the government from the party. And they were, because I think they hoped to turn the party into just a normal political party. You know, China has always allowed some non-communist party parties, but it was fake. You know, they were these fake little democratic parties with a few old guys, and they had no power at all. They always allowed this. I think what people were hoping was that if you could separate the party from the government and subject the party to law, put the party under the legal system, that would be a way to, you know, further political reform. They never made a lot of progress with that, but when Xi Jinping came in 2012, so 2012, I would say, is a kind of turning point. Xi Jinping takes power in 2012, and he just is not going to allow the separation of the party and the government. And he says so. He says that's over. There's no more movement towards separating the party from the government. In fact, he's merging them back together. And I think it's this lesson from Tiananmen Square and the falling apart of the Soviet Union. He's not going to let that happen on his watch. It's not. There's going to be no Gorbachev. So yeah, he is exerting Communist Party ideological control more and more over the government staff. So there's more ideological training, more sort of emphasis on Communist Party values and things like that. He continues to purge people that he thinks are threatening his power. So if you read the newspaper, I mean, just like 2 days ago, he pushed out some top military leaders, and he says it's corruption. For sure, it's corruption. I mean, the system is fundamentally corrupt because, you know, it just is. There are lots of people who are corrupt, but he picks out his enemies who are corrupt and he punishes them, so he's doing the same thing with the private sector too, which is interesting. You know, they had formally, businesses in China were supposed to have Communist Party units in the business, but the government never really enforced that for a long time. It was never taken seriously. Now, Xi Jinping takes that kind of stuff seriously. So if you're a corporation in China, even if you're a private corporation, if you have a certain number of employees, you're required to have a Communist Party cell in the company. And they're starting to enforce that stuff. And so like Jack Ma, I mean, I think Jack Ma, he got in trouble, I think, for criticizing the securities regulators or something, right? He said something like the securities, it was probably kind of sharp, like the securities regulators are a bunch of farmers or something. I think he said something that was too funny, too rude, too critical. And so, even the private sector, because I don't think Xi Jinping fundamentally believes in a private sector, right? I mean, if you're a real Marxist, why would you allow a private sector to be really separate from the state? That's not part of your ideology. And I think he really believes this. So I just don't think he believes that China needs to have a private sector that's fully outside of party influence. So, that's, and he's been, so the distinction between the state and the private, that distinction has been falling apart too. It was, in the 90s, one of the things that China did was they rationalized the state industry sector. Before that, everything had been state industry. Every productive unit was part of the state. And one of the secrets of their model was they let the private sector grow up alongside the state sector. So you ended up having them both. So there was no big bang. In the Eastern European or Russian sense, when communism fell apart, they were just going to have what they called the big bang. They were going to blow up the state sector, privatize everything, and you would immediately go from a Soviet system to a kind of private system. China never did. There was no big bang in China. So they slowly rationalized the public sector and allowed the private sector to grow up alongside the public sector. And I think, so if you look at the public, like the state-owned industries in China today, I think the state-owned sector they consolidated a lot of them, so built big state-owned companies, and they've kind of professionalized them too. So they don't operate like an old Soviet car factory or something. They operate like internationally competitive companies, but they're state-owned. And then the private sector, and I don't think he ever really thought that the private sector should be independent and totally separate. So the private sector in China is, increasingly under pressure to kind of be more like the public sector. The distinction between public and private is kind of getting more fuzzy. So
It's kind of like intimately linked with what we learned also yesterday, because when you think about the rise of these companies, you also understand how China is actually getting to merge and interact with the global trade and organization, because a lot of those companies were the ones that generated the complaints from other countries regarding unfair treatment on trade and taxes and all that stuff. Like you have, for example, the purge of Visa and MasterCard, they aren't allowed to operate in China, also international banks and all other figures and forms of institutions that aren't allowed.
Yeah, I think it's related. I mean, if these are, right, especially with someone like Xi Jinping, if your idea is to build these big, what we call national champions, big national champion companies that are state-owned, then you don't really want the foreigners competing with them in your own territory. So, and you can see this clearly with the law firms. The foreign law firms are leaving China. Right, the foreign law firms, every day, if you read the legal press, the foreign law firms are closing their Beijing offices, they're closing their Shanghai offices, they're leaving Hong Kong. And because the Chinese law firms, and this fits Xi Jinping's view of how the world should be, the Chinese law firms have now gotten quite good. And they're big and they're powerful and they have thousands of lawyers. And so from his perspective, when we don't need the foreign lawyers anymore, we'll just get rid of the foreign lawyers. And, they don't say it exactly, but some of the things they've done have made it very difficult for foreign law firms to operate in China. So, for example, like rules about secrecy, rules about what is a state secret. If you're a American or Brazilian law firm and if you have an office in Beijing, you assume that you can keep your client's information secret. But in Xi Jinping's world, he doesn't care about legal professional rules, and they one of the things that foreign law firms did in Beijing and it did in China for a long time was due diligence. So if you have a foreign client and they're considering doing business in China, they're considering buying a Chinese company, something like that, somebody has to do due diligence, go out and find out what the situation is with that Chinese company. Some of the people who were doing due diligence were arrested and accused of being spies or accused of stealing state secrets and things like that. And once that happens, then the foreign lawyers all look at that and say, I can't operate here anymore, right? If I can't do due diligence for my clients, if I can't keep my clients' information secret from the government, I can't be a lawyer here. Now the Chinese lawyers, they have ethical rules too, but they can't leave. They're stuck there. So it's very interesting. The number of foreign law firms is dropping quickly. They're closing their offices. They're packing up. The number of lawyers in their offices is going way down. And I don't think Xi Jinping cares at all. He probably thinks that's basically a good thing. And he's also, he and the leadership, they're supporting Chinese law firms to become global. So they call it like the international foreign, what do they call it? The foreign rule of law. They have some term for it. Basically, what they want is for Chinese, because Chinese companies are operating all over the world now, they want Chinese law firms to be able to service them. And the Chinese law firms, they're big. They have a lot of their lawyers were educated abroad. A lot of their lawyers, the leaders, often worked abroad. Often they have lawyers who worked for foreign law firms who are now working for Chinese law firms. So the Chinese law firms have gotten very sophisticated. And the whole thing is kind of a Chinese development story. It's like, be pragmatic at the beginning, get the foreign lawyers in, have them facilitate international trade. They help us develop. At some point, you don't need the foreign lawyers anymore because the foreign lawyers have trained your lawyers, and now your lawyers are pretty good. And your lawyers are like Jack Ma. You can disappear. If some Chinese lawyer tries to, the human rights lawyers in China do push on these issues. There's a whole community of human rights lawyers. And they would like the Bar Association to be independent, for example. But in Xi Jinping's mind, why would you let lawyers have an independent association? The Bar Association in China is a tool for government control. That's what it is. The government uses bar associations to regulate the legal profession. They're not an independent professional organization that tries to have political influence. That's not the way it works. But Xi Jinping has really cracked down on the human rights lawyers, right? The situation for human rights lawyers has gotten much worse. You don't read about them in the paper much anymore. There were lawyers who specialized in especially religious rights. Lawyers who would defend. They'd get involved with labor disputes. They would get involved with a lot of labor disputes, a lot of disputes about land being taken for development purposes. A lot of lawyers would take these religious freedom cases because there's a lot of Christianity in China. But again, the government wants to control Christianity. And those lawyers, you don't see much about them anymore. They've been imprisoned or intimidated to the point of just, being much less active. So, and that's really, you can trace a lot of that to Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012. So how long that will last, to me, it will last as long as he has power. I don't see him changing. So there would have to be a turnover in the leadership in China, I think. So the legal system chugs along. They keep creating new laws. the law schools, they educate, like Brazil, they have thousands of law schools. Thousands, and they have, undergraduate law, they have master's programs, they have PhD programs, they've got lawyers, kind of like Brazil. Your two countries are kind of out there in terms of just educating a lot of people in law. But at its core, the legal system just still has these fundamental problems of like judicial independence and trying to figure out what the law actually is is more complicated because of the party influence. It's quite difficult. But if the question is economic development, so one of my interests is what do legal systems have to do with economic development? You look at China and you say, well, you can have a lot of economic development with a pretty bad legal system. It doesn't have to do everything, but it has to do a few things. The Chinese have never, as far as I know, the government has never really expropriated a foreign investment. Somebody was mentioning Cargill. If you're a company that operates all over the world, some countries sometimes will just take your factory away, like Maduro, like in Venezuela. You can operate in Venezuela, and then you get a new president, and the new regime takes your property away. Maybe you get it back 10 years later when there's a different government, and you get your property back. China has never done that since 1978. I don't know of any situation where the government actually just took somebody's property away. So did the foreigners have clear property rights, like Osomoglu and those guys would say? No, nobody had clear property rights, but they were confident that the government was not going to take their property away. And as long as you stayed out of politics, you could make money, especially if you were exporting. So businesses could look at China and say, well, if we go in there, the labor is going to be cheap, the local government wants us there doing production. The tax situation is pretty predictable. My impression from talking to lawyers is once you understand what the tax liability is, it's pretty clear. You pay your taxes and then you take the rest and you can go home with it. So, is that legal transparency, predictability in the German sense? No, it's not. It's more like a political commitment in favor of economic growth. And that was really true at the beginning. It's less true now, but because the legal system is much more complete. But still, if the government wanted to take your property, they could take your property because the legal system isn't independent. But they don't do that, So.
Do you see some similarity with Arab states like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, or maybe I really don't know. I'm asking this. They too are authoritarian regimes, but allow some economic freedom, I think. Or
I think the big difference is that they don't, and this may change, but they don't need to have a development model except drilling for gas or oil. Right, so they haven't needed to industrialize. Their development model didn't involve industrialization, maybe until now. I think the current leader in Saudi Arabia, he talks like he wants to have a normal economy. They haven't really had normal economies, right? They've just pumped gas and sold it. China couldn't do that. China doesn't. China actually. This is important for Brazil. China, it's a big country, but the decent farmland is very small compared to their population. Like the term in English is the arable land is very small in China considering their population. They have deserts, they have mountains, they have floods. And that's kind of like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan too. Those countries, the only way they could develop successfully was through, I think, really exporting, manufacturing and exporting manufactured products. And so they all started at the bottom, manufacturing like shoes, little electric connector. You know, Foxconn is now this giant company. Foxconn started making little plastic connectors for one of the American computer companies, like Compaq or something. They were a subcontractor making simple little plastic connectors for electronic stuff. And then, and that's how they developed. So the countries in the Middle East, I mean, if they wanted to have normal economies, I think they would have to do something like that. But I mean, the people that run like Qatar, they have more money than they can use, and they have very few citizens. So they have all the work done by non-citizens who come and work there, and then they can kick them out whenever they want, and the actual citizens get free money from the government. So I don't know. The countries that, if I look around the world, the countries like Vietnam is kind of following the Asian, Vietnam is kind of following the model of manufacturing and exporting. And that's because of the Trump-China fights. A lot of the manufacturing is moving from China to Vietnam. A lot of the American companies to get around. Well, Korean companies too. There's a lot of manufacturing that was done in China is moving to Vietnam. The Philippines could maybe do it, or countries in Latin America could maybe do it, but you have to be very open to foreign investment if you want to play that game.
What is Chinese government take on private arbitration?
Private arbitration?
Is this a thing in China?
Yeah, I mean, what it always has been. So that I should have mentioned that actually. So when they created the joint venture statute in the 70s, when they created their basic little foreign tax law thing, they also wanted arbitration. So, and this kind of goes along with, and a lot of it's kind of a socialist thing. I think in the socialist world, arbitration was always, I think in the Soviet Union, they would use arbitration between the state-owned companies. So the Chinese they set up an arbitration body early, CTAC, it's called China, CIETA, CTAC arbitration. And then you had the normal fights that you have in international commerce, so you sign a contract. What's the dispute resolution? The Chinese side would always say, well, we want arbitration done at CTAC, and we want Chinese law to apply. And the foreigners would always say, no, we don't want Chinese law to apply, and we don't want CTAC arbitration. We want New York arbitration or Paris arbitration and something else. And then you'd have these discussions about it as part of the contract, and then whoever had the more bargaining power would get what they wanted. So CTAC, and CTAC one of the pragmatic things the Chinese did was CTAC would allow some foreign arbitrators because they would allow some foreign arbitrator. They would invite some foreign lawyers or some foreign law professors to be arbitrators in CTAC to help make it more acceptable to the foreign investors. They didn't do it because they believed in it. They thought, well, if the foreign investors, we want the foreign investors to come in, we need to have dispute settlement. They'll be happier if they see a foreigner sitting on the CTAC arbitration panel. And if you didn't do CTAC arbitration, if you got like Paris or something, then you had to enforce that award in China if you won. So then you're back to China again. So anyway, this is just the world of international dispute settlement. And yeah, arbitration was always part of it.
Foreign, if I may add, foreign community tends to criticize CTAC for being too pro-China, Chinese parts. But IAC, the Hong Kong
Yeah.
Center, used to have an important role.
Yeah.
Because of Hong Kong, but now
Yeah, the Chinese would often they'd say, okay, you don't like SeaTac, we don't like Paris, how about Hong Kong? And then Hong Kong was a more acceptable arbitration forum for the Chinese government than
So,
like New York or Paris.
do foreign investors are confident that they can enforce arbitration awards granted in other councils, like in China territory?
That's a practice question, you know. I mean, are you ever? I mean, I worked in Korea, you know. The Koreans would say, "Oh, yes, of course." And sometimes foreign judicial decisions, foreign judicial orders are supposed to be enforceable too. There are treaties about this of recognizing foreign court judgments.
Commercial thing, no problem. As long as there's no connection to public interest.
Yeah. But the Koreans were terrible. When I was a lawyer in Korea, my firm, we did this with this kind of article for the law firm, and we were saying, oh yes, the Korean courts will now enforce foreign court judgments. But the only example was like a divorce decision. It's like, well, nobody cares if Korean courts will enforce a divorce from New York. That's not what people care about. People care about whether you get some big litigation award in the US or Brazil or whatever, and then you need, because the defendant has no assets there, you have to go find their assets. And the Korean courts were terrible about this. I think a lot of countries are reluctant. You guys know better than me the current situation, but it was a lot of countries, the courts are very reluctant to enforce foreign court judgments. Arbitration should be better, but you know, it's good if they have some assets abroad, is all I would say. I also did some maritime law, and the maritime lawyers, you know, the maritime lawyers are experts at finding assets around the world because people have ships, and the ships are moving around the world. So if you can find a ship somewhere, you can seize it, and then they have to pay the judgment. But yeah, yeah. You know, one thing that happened in China a lot was actually, and the Chinese recognized that this was a big problem, they called it local protectionism. So even within China, say you're a foreign company or a Chinese company, if you have a lawsuit against a company in, say, Beijing, or not Beijing so much, but like other parts of China. So you get a court judgment in Shanghai from a Shanghai court, and you have to enforce it out in Chongqing against the company that's located in Chongqing. You get your court judgment, you have to enforce it in Chongqing where the assets are, but you go out there and you discover that that company has close relations with the government in Chongqing. And because the government controls the courts, you go into the courts in Chongqing and they won't enforce your judgment from Shanghai. So, and this was a huge problem, and this was a problem for Chinese companies and foreign companies, and it shows something about China. China has not exactly been an organized, authoritarian, monolithic thing like Soviet Russia. I don't even know if Soviet Russia was like that, but that's our image of Soviet Russia. The image in China, the situation in China has always been more complicated. I'll talk about that tomorrow some, but that was one of the keys to their success economically. There's a lot of competition among, like in the U.S. You know, I mentioned yesterday that in the U.S. there's competition among the states. So if California raises the taxes too high, Musk will move his factories to Texas where the taxes are lower. We have this kind of competition internally. And China had the same thing. And so it's good and bad, right? It feeds a lot of corruption because the local governments want economic development and they'll favor their local companies, and there's a lot of bribery and all sorts of corruption. On the other hand, I think it's been sort of positive for economic growth because they competed for economic growth in their territories. And so China is a kind of federal, you could say China is a kind of non-legal federalism, like Brazil has legal federalism, but it sounds like it's more and more sort of centralized. China claims to be a centralized system, but if you look at it, there's actually a lot of, practically speaking, there's a lot of kind of localism. So yeah, the current situation about enforceability of judgments, I wouldn't really comment on that. But I would say that Hong Kong, the Hong Kong, people are losing their confidence in Hong Kong because of the Beijing government's increasing control over Hong Kong. So Singapore, I think a lot of the arbitration activity is going to move to Singapore, away from Hong Kong. But still, you have that problem. If they don't have assets in Singapore, you have to take that award from Singapore. You have to take it somewhere and enforce it. So, good luck. Good luck with that. Yeah. Any more questions, comments? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.